Everybody has heard of the Gothic Line. It is the famous one, the great German fortified belt running across northern Italy from Pisa to Rimini, dug into the Apennines, the position Kesselring intended to hold for the rest of the war. It has a name that sounds like history. It appears in every book about the Italian campaign. Almost nobody has heard of the Paula Line. And yet, in the last week of July 1944, the Paula Line was the most important defensive position in Italy because it was the line standing directly in front of Florence, and because it was the thing buying time for the Gothic Line to be finished behind it. Every day the Paula Line was held was another day of German engineers pouring concrete, laying wire, and digging gun pits in the mountains to the north. The Germans expected it to hold for a considerable time. The ground was ideal for defense. The steep, folded hill country south of the Arno, a landscape of ridges and olive terraces and stone farmhouses, where every crest looks down on the one before it, and armour is supposed to be useless. It was held for a week. On the 27th of July 1944, the 2nd New Zealand Division attacked the Paula Line on a front of about 4 miles. On the 3rd of August, 7 days later, the New Zealanders and the 6th South African Armoured Division broke clean through the main line and drove for Florence. That night, the German command in the city began destroying the bridges of the oldest surviving Renaissance capital in Europe. This is the story of that week, what the Germans were counting on, what the New Zealanders did to it, and what actually surprised the men on the other side of the wire. Now, the honesty this channel runs on, because there are 2 things in this video's title that need adjusting before we go any further. The first is small but worth stating. New Zealand troops were not the first Allied soldiers into Florence. That distinction belongs to the South Africans, an armoured patrol drawn from the Imperial Light Horse and the Kimberley Regiment entered the centre of Florence on the 4th of August 1944, with New Zealanders following close behind and British units after them. The breakthrough was a joint effort by 2 divisions, and if you tell the story as a New Zealand solo performance, you are stealing credit from South African soldiers who earned theirs. This series does not do that. The second correction is bigger, and it shapes everything. There is no famous German quotation about the New Zealanders at Florence, no captured general's remark, no shocked diary entry that circulates in the histories. If somebody produces one from a German archive, this channel will happily make a follow-up. But this series has now retired, invented quotes attributed to Rommel, to Navy SEALs, to America's Cup skippers, and to Tito's partisans. And it is not going to manufacture a German one here. So what actually shocked the Germans? That question has a real answer, and it is written in their own behaviour rather than their words. Across the last week of July and the first days of August 1944, the German command in front of Florence did 4 things that revealed unmistakably what it had not expected. It committed reserves it had intended to hold back. It abandoned the Paula Line substantially faster than its own timetable required. It ordered the demolition of every bridge in Florence but one, including structures of immense cultural value, in an act of destruction that suggests a force with no confidence at all in its ability to hold the river line. And it pulled back to the Gothic Line before that line was ready to receive it. Armies do not do those things when a battle is going according to plan. Here is where the next 4 chapters go. First, the division that arrived in front of Florence, because to understand why the breakthrough happened, you have to understand what had happened to the 2nd New Zealand Division 5 months earlier at Cassino, and what it had become by the time it reached Tuscany. This was a formation that had been badly hurt, rebuilt, and fundamentally reorganized into something that no longer fought like a standard infantry division at all. Then the ground and the plan, what the Paula Line actually was, why the Germans trusted the terrain, and why that trust was a mistake against these particular troops. Then the week itself, the 27th of July to the 3rd of August, and the specific tactical method that took the line apart. This is the operational heart of the story, and it comes down to something this channel has documented in New Zealand campaigns from Crete to Malaya to Afghanistan. An obsession with the night, the close approach, and the willingness to arrive on top of a defender before he knows anyone is coming. Then the bridges. On the night of the 3rd and 4th of August, with the line broken and the Allies coming, German engineers blew every bridge across the Arno in Florence, except the Ponte Vecchio, and demolished the medieval quarters at either end of it to block the approaches. Florence had been declared an open city. The bridges went anyway. What that decision says about the German position and what it cost the city belongs in this story, because it was the direct consequence of the breakthrough. And finally, the ledger. What the New Zealanders actually accomplished, what it cost them, why Florence did not end the campaign, and the honest answer to the question in the title. One last thing before the shooting starts, and it frames everything that follows. The 2nd New Zealand Division had been in Italy since the autumn of 1943. It had fought at Orsogna in the winter mud. It had been thrown at Cassino in February and March of 1944 and cut to pieces there. It had watched the monastery bombed and taken casualties in the rubble for nothing. By the summer of 1944, these were men who had been fighting continuously, in one theatre or another, since 1940. And in July 1944, they were sent to break a fresh German line in front of one of the most beautiful cities on earth. They did it in 7 days. To understand what happened at the Paula Line, you have to understand what the 2nd New Zealand Division had been through to get there, and what it had turned into. 5 months earlier, this division had been broken at Cassino. That is not an exaggeration of the sort this channel avoids. In February and March 1944, the New Zealanders were committed to the 2nd and 3rd battles of Monte Cassino, and those battles were among the worst experiences any Allied formation had in the Western Theatre. The division attacked into a town that had been bombed into rubble, against German paratroopers who used the rubble better than the attackers did. It took the railway station and could not hold it. It lost heavily, in men and in something harder to replace, the belief that effort produces results. Freiberg's division came out of Cassino needing to be rebuilt, and the rebuilding is where this story really starts. Because the New Zealand division that fought its way into Tuscany in July 1944 was not organized like an ordinary infantry division. It had been reorganized to include its own armoured brigade. The 4th New Zealand Armoured Brigade, equipped with Sherman tanks and crewed by New Zealanders. That sounds like an administrative detail. It was not. Most infantry divisions in Italy fought alongside tanks belonging to somebody else. Armour would be attached for an operation, work with infantry it had never met, speak on radio nets it had to be patched into, and leave when the operation ended. Cooperation was possible but always slightly foreign. 2 organisations trying to combine under fire. The New Zealand division owned its tanks. The same armoured regiments worked with the same infantry battalions over months, in the same division, under the same commander, with shared signals and shared habits and, crucially, shared trust. Infantry knew what those particular tank crews would risk for them. Tank crews knew those particular infantry would not leave them exposed in a village. In a close country, that difference is worth more than extra guns. And a close country is exactly what Tuscany is. Add to that the divisional artillery, which by 1944 had become one of the most respected in the 8th Army, capable of concentrating the fire of the whole division onto a single target with a speed that impressed everyone who worked with it. Add engineers who had spent a year learning to bridge Italian rivers under fire and clear German minefields in the dark. Add the infantry battalions themselves, including the 28th Maori Battalion, whose reputation for the close assault this channel has documented before. That was the instrument that arrived in front of Florence, an experienced, self-contained, all-arms formation, rebuilt after a mauling, and, this matters, with something to prove. The advance north through Tuscany began in earnest in July 1944. The Germans were not making a stand yet. They were conducting a fighting withdrawal, trading space for time while the Gothic Line was prepared. But a German fighting withdrawal in 1944 was not a retreat. It was a systematic, professional program of destruction and delay. Every bridge blown, every culvert cratered, roads mined, snipers and machine guns left behind to make each village cost hours, artillery registered on the obvious approaches, and demolitions timed so the pursuing force spent its days repairing rather than advancing. The New Zealanders pushed through it anyway. On the 16th of July 1944, elements of the division took Arezzo, a significant town on the road north, and a real fight rather than a walk-in. From Arezzo, the division turned toward Florence, and the country changed for the worse. South of Florence lies the Chianti country, and it is beautiful in a way that is entirely hostile to an attacking army. Steep hills, deep gullies, vineyards and olive terraces that break up formations and hide defenders. Narrow, winding roads with sharp drops, easily blocked, impossible to bypass with vehicles. And massive stone farmhouses, the classic Tuscan casa colonica, with walls a metre thick, which convert instantly into small fortresses with commanding fields of fire. For a defending German battalion commander, this was close to ideal. His men could hold a farmhouse and a ridge with a handful of machine guns and a couple of anti-tank guns, force the attacker to deploy, inflict casualties, then pull back a kilometre to the next identical position and do it again. Every day of that was a day earned for the engineers working on the Gothic Line. That is the war the New Zealanders fought through late July, hill after hill, farmhouse after farmhouse, in summer heat, with the dust of Italian roads coating everything and every stone building potentially holding a machine gun. And the Germans in front of them were not second-rate troops. The formations covering the approaches to Florence included some of Kesselring's most capable units. Men who understood delay operations completely and who had spent the summer becoming expert at making the Allies pay for ground. By the last week of July, the division had ground its way up to something different. Not a delaying position, but a prepared line, held with the intention of stopping the advance rather than slowing it. The Paula Line. North of it lay Florence, the Arno, and beyond that, the mountains where the Gothic Line was still being built. If the Paula Line held for 2 or 3 weeks, the Germans would have the Gothic Line ready, and the Allied advance would come up against a fortified belt in the Apennines, just as autumn arrived to fill the mountain valleys with rain and mud. If it broke quickly, they would be reversing into an unfinished position with an Allied army on their heels. Everything depended on how long a defensive line in a perfect defensive country could hold against a division that had spent 4 years learning how to take exactly this kind of ground. The attack went in on the 27th of July. The Paula Line was not a Maginot Line. It is important to be accurate about what it was, because the point of this chapter is that it was strong enough to have worked. It was a field defense system, the kind the German army built superbly and quickly, prepared positions on the dominant ridges south of Florence, sited to cover the roads and the natural approaches. Machine guns positioned to support each other, so that attacking one meant being fired on from 2 others. Anti-tank guns dug in and camouflaged, covering the few routes armour could use. Mortars registered on the obvious forming-up areas, mines on the approaches, demolitions prepared on every route behind, so a withdrawal could be covered by cratering the road as the last troops passed. It ran across the hills south of Florence, and its purpose was explicit: shield the city and the Arno crossings, and hold long enough for the Gothic Line to be completed. Against that, the New Zealand attack opened on the 27th of July, 1944, on a front of roughly 4 miles. 4 miles is a narrow frontage for a division, and the narrowness is deliberate. It concentrates. Rather than spreading across the landscape and attacking everything weakly, the division could put its full weight, infantry, its own armour, and that formidable artillery, against a limited section of line, break it and exploit through the gap, rather than trying to push the whole line backwards at once. What followed was 7 days of the most characteristic New Zealand fighting of the war, and the method deserves to be spelled out, because it is the answer to the question in this video's title. It started at night. The New Zealand Division's signature, visible in every campaign this channel has covered, from Crete in 1941 to the desert to Cassino, was the night attack. Not a probe, a full battalion assault, in darkness, delivered with the closest possible approach and finished at very short range. The reason is brutal arithmetic. In daylight, an attacker crossing open ground against dug-in machine guns is feeding men into a killing zone. The defender sees everything and corrects his artillery onto it. At night, the machine guns fire on fixed lines into the dark, and the mortars fire on pre-registered points. And none of it matters if the attacking infantry are already past those points before anyone realizes they are moving. The defender's advantage, observation, is switched off. The attacker's advantage, knowing his own plan, becomes decisive. Doing it requires things that can't be improvised. Navigation in darkness across a broken country, by compass and pace counting, with hundreds of men. Absolute noise discipline on the approach. Junior leaders who can hold a formation together when nobody can see the man beside him. The nerve to keep walking toward positions you know are occupied, silently, until you are close enough to rush. And the willingness to finish it at grenade and bayonet range. The New Zealand Division had spent 4 years acquiring exactly that, and by 1944 it was among the best in the world at it. Now add the tanks, and this is where the German terrain assumption failed. The German plan rested on the Chianti Hills being effectively armour-proof, too steep, too broken, too narrow, with easily blocked roads. That assumption was reasonable, and mostly true. What it did not account for was a division whose armour and infantry had trained together for a year, and were prepared to work as one organism in ground that looked impossible. New Zealand Shermans went where the map said tanks should not go, up terraces, along tracks, into positions from which a single tank could put high explosive rounds into a stone farmhouse at short range, while infantry worked around behind it. A tank in that role is not a breakthrough weapon. It is a portable siege gun for cracking buildings, and against a defensive system built on fortified farmhouses, it is devastating. Infantry located and fixed the position, tanks demolished it, and the whole apparatus moved to the next ridge. Behind all of it worked the artillery, able to bring the entire divisional weight down on one point at short notice. Against a defence organised around a small number of key positions, that concentration mattered more than any general bombardment. Now put the sequence together and see it from the German side. You hold a strong position on a ridge. It has been sighted properly. Your machine guns support each other, your artillery is registered, and the ground in front of you is a nightmare for an attacker. During the day, nothing much happens beyond patrolling and shelling. You are doing your job, buying time. Then, in the dark, without a warning bombardment, infantry appear inside your position. Not advancing across your killing ground where your guns are pointed. Inside it, at close range, in numbers, with grenades. Your fixed lines of fire are now behind them, useless. Your artillery cannot fire on your own position. Your first accurate picture of the attack is a firefight in your own trenches. And in the morning, when you have fallen back to the next ridge to do it again, tanks arrive in the country you were assured tanks could not reach, and begin knocking down the farmhouse you are holding, one wall at a time. Now do that 7 nights in a row. That is what the Paula Line experienced between the 27th of July and the 3rd of August, 1944. Not one dramatic breakthrough battle, but the relentless serial dismantling of a defensive system, position by position, mostly in darkness, by troops who had turned this exact procedure into a professional routine. On the 3rd of August, the main line went. The 2nd New Zealand Division and the 6th South African Armoured Division broke clean through and drove north toward Florence and the Arno. The line that was supposed to buy the Gothic Line several weeks had lasted a week. And in Florence that night, German engineers began setting demolition charges under one of the most photographed pieces of architecture in the world. What the Germans did on the night of the 3rd and 4th of August 1944 is the clearest evidence of what the breakthrough had done to them. Florence had been declared an open city. That declaration is supposed to mean something specific in the laws of war. The defenders will not fight for it, the attackers will not bomb or shell it, and the city passes intact from one side to the other. It exists precisely so that places like Florence, a city holding a substantial fraction of the surviving art of the Italian Renaissance, do not get destroyed for the sake of a few days' delay. The Germans accepted that principle for the city itself. They did not fight street by street through Florence, and the city's great buildings survived. That should be acknowledged plainly. What they did instead was destroy its bridges. On the night of the 3rd and 4th of August, with the Paula Line broken and the New Zealanders and South Africans coming north, German engineers blew every bridge across the Arno in Florence except one. Among the bridges destroyed was the Santa Trinita, a 16th-century bridge widely regarded as one of the most beautiful in Europe, an elegant piece of Renaissance engineering that had stood for nearly 400 years. It was reduced to rubble in the river. The one they spared was the Ponte Vecchio, the medieval covered bridge lined with shops, standing since the 14th century. It survives today, and its survival is usually attributed to a direct order from Hitler, who had visited Florence before the war and admired it. But sparing the bridge did not mean sparing the neighborhoods. Because the Ponte Vecchio was left standing, it had to be made unusable. An intact bridge in the hands of an advancing enemy is a gift. So German engineers demolished the medieval buildings at both ends of it, collapsing the ancient streets around the approaches into impassable mounds of masonry. The bridge survived. The historic quarters at either end of it did not. Think about the calculation being made there. An army in an orderly withdrawal, confident in its next position, does not need to do this. It has time to organize a proper defense on the far bank. Blowing every crossing in a major city, destroying a 400-year-old bridge and flattening medieval streets to bury the approaches to another, is what an army does when it is genuinely worried about being followed too closely, and when it has concluded it cannot hold the river line for long. That destruction is the German answer to the question in this video's title. It is not a quotation, it is a demolition order, and it says, "We did not expect to be here this soon, and we do not believe we can stop them at the water." The tactical effect was real and serious. The Allies now faced a major river running through a dense urban area with no bridges, in a city full of civilians, with the enemy holding the northern bank. The engineering problem was severe. The humanitarian problem was worse. Florence's population had endured the fighting. The demolitions had wrecked whole districts, and services were shattered. Fighting continued in and around the city and on the northern side for days after the initial entry. The war did not politely stop at Arno. Then came the 4th of August and the entry into the city. Here, again, the honest version. The first Allied troops into central Florence were South African, an armoured patrol from the Imperial Light Horse and the Kimberley Regiment, part of the 6th South African Armoured Division. New Zealanders came in close behind them, followed by British units. It was a shared victory delivered by a shared breakthrough, and Italians in Florence that day were being liberated by an army drawn from half the planet. There is one more element of the Florence story that this series will not leave out, because it changes the shape of the whole thing. The city was not passive. Florence had an active partisan resistance, and during the German withdrawal, the partisans of the Tuscan Committee of National Liberation fought in the city, attacking German positions, protecting infrastructure, and taking casualties. The bell of the Palazzo Vecchio, the Martinella, was rung to signal the rising, and it is still rung in Florence each August to commemorate the liberation. Italian partisans died in that fighting, and the modern city's commemorations honor the resistance and the Allied forces together. That matters for accuracy and it matters for tone. Florence was not simply handed from one foreign army to another while the locals watched. Its own people fought for it. And there is a final, quieter piece of the aftermath that reflects well on the men involved. The Allies who entered Florence walked into a city stripped of its bridges, its water supply damaged, its population hungry and traumatized, with unexploded ordnance in the ruins. Engineers went to work at once on crossings and services. The machinery of the Allied military government followed. Soldiers who had spent a week killing Germans in the Chianti Hills spent the following week clearing rubble and restoring water to a city most of them had never seen before. The New Zealanders did not stay long. The division was pulled out of the Florence sector and, within weeks, sent east, because the war's next act was already scheduled, and it was going to be worse. The Gothic Line was waiting. So, what shocked the Germans when the New Zealanders broke through in front of Florence? Here is the honest answer, delivered the way this channel has delivered it 14 times now. Not a sentence, but a set of documented behaviors. And they add up to something more interesting than any quotation. The first shock was the clock. The Paula Line existed to buy time. Its whole strategic purpose was to hold the Allies south of the Arno, long enough for the Gothic Line to be completed in the mountains to the north. German planning assumed a defensive battle of some weeks in a country that overwhelmingly favored the defense. It lasted about 7 days from the opening of the New Zealand attack to the breakthrough on the 3rd of August. And the consequence was exactly what the Germans had been trying to avoid. They fell back onto the Gothic Line before it was finished, and spent the rest of the summer and autumn scrambling to complete fortifications with an Allied army pressing them. The second shock was the ground. The German defensive plan for the approaches to Florence rested on a reasonable assumption that the hill country south of the city was effectively closed to armour, and that infantry attacking through it could be bled at every ridge. That assumption failed against a division that owned its own tanks and had spent a year teaching them to work with its own infantry in exactly this kind of terrain. The farmhouse strongpoints that were meant to be expensive to take were reduced by direct tank fire at short range, and the ridges that were meant to be impassable to vehicles were not. The third shock, one German unit in Italy had already met, at Cassino and in the desert, was the darkness. There is a reason this channel keeps returning to the same New Zealand signature. From the counterattack at Galatas in 1941 to the midnight bayonet breakout at Minkar Kaim in 1942, to the Cassino railway station in early 1944, to the Paula Line in July of the same year, the pattern is identical. Close the distance in the dark and finish it at short range. It is the hardest thing to do well in infantry warfare. It requires years of training and exceptional junior leadership, and it strips a well-sighted defensive position of the very advantage it was built around. The fourth piece of evidence is the demolition of the bridges, the act of a command that had lost confidence in its ability to hold the next line, taken at the cost of a Renaissance bridge and several medieval streets. Put those four together, and you have the shock, documented in German decisions rather than German words. A line that was supposed to hold for weeks and held for one, in terrain that was supposed to stop tanks and didn't, broken by an enemy that kept arriving in the dark, followed by a withdrawal violent enough to wreck a city's crossings. Now the ledger, because this series never stops at the victory. The breakthrough at Florence did not shorten the war in Italy. That is the hard truth about the whole campaign. Within weeks, the same New Zealand division was moved to the Adriatic coast for the assault on the Gothic Line proper, Operation Olive, from late August 1944. And there it ran into the fortified belt it had been racing to beat, along with the autumn rains, the rivers of the Romagna, and some of the most miserable fighting of the entire war. The division would still be fighting in northern Italy in the spring of 1945. Its road from Florence ran through Rimini, the Romagna mud, Faenza and the Cigno, and did not finish until the drive to Trieste in May 1945. A story this channel has told separately. The cost is worth stating too. The 2nd New Zealand Division suffered heavily in Italy, and the summer advance was not free. Every one of those farmhouse strongpoints in the Chianti Hills was taken by men who had to walk toward it, and the New Zealand cemeteries in Italy hold the arithmetic. New Zealand's dead in the Italian campaign ran into the thousands, from a country whose entire population was smaller than many of the cities its soldiers fought through. And Florence itself. Florence survived, battered, bridgeless and hungry, but standing. The Uffizi, the Duomo, the Palazzo Vecchio, the vast inheritance of the Renaissance came through. The Santa Trinita Bridge was later rebuilt using stone recovered from the riverbed, a restoration that took years and stands as its own small monument to what the war did there. So here is the summary this video's title was reaching for, stated accurately. In the last week of July 1944, the 2nd New Zealand Division attacked a German defence line built to shield Florence and to buy time for the Gothic Line. In 7 days, in company with the 6th South African Armoured Division, it broke that line. The Germans, who had planned to hold for weeks in ground they considered ideal, abandoned the position, destroyed the bridges of Florence behind them, and fell back onto an unfinished fortified belt they had hoped to complete at leisure. They left no famous quotation about the men who did it. They left something more reliable, a wrecked river crossing, a broken timetable, and a defensive line that failed. In a seventh of the time it was supposed to last. That is what shocked them, and it was delivered by a division from a country of 1.5 million people, a division that had been smashed at Cassino 5 months earlier, rebuilt itself, and then walked into the dark 7 nights in a row until the line in front of Florence came apart.